Okay, we're in the last section of letter 25. And in this letter, the Alter Rebbe addresses first at a very pragmatic level. And then, as we often do, we delve into the Pnimius HaTorah. This is a good example of the whole message of Tanya. I guess every letter is a good example, and every word is. We know that in Torah, we have to deal with the very tangible, what we call nigla, the things that we can see, touch, and feel, such as what to do if I put chicken soup in the cereal bowl. That's one level. Then we deal with what's going on behind it. Like, why do we have the different mitzvahs? What are the life lessons from eating matzah or honoring parents? And then there's almost like the biochemical underpinnings, which we would call the Kabbalistic underpinnings of what's going on when we shake the lulav and esrog and so on at a subatomic level in the spiritual realms. And then we have how we can tie all of these together, that they're not in silos, they're actually all different layers within each other. And here, this letter began with the Alter Rebbe addressing a very tangible, practical issue that we may encounter. What to do if I'm trying to daven, and especially on the heels of the previous two letters that speaks about the profound opportunity of tefillah, of davening, and somebody is disturbing me. So I have a number of levels to deal with. One, how do I deal with that person? Two, how do I deal with it internally, that I'm getting annoyed and frustrated and irritated? And then what we're going to deal with today is, well, what's going on at like I'm calling it a subterranean level? What's going on in the deeper spiritual cosmos that are resulting in this configuration of a person talking and disturbing me and being even deliberately antagonistic while I am trying to be in alignment with Hashem? So this letter now shifts to understanding the idea of speech, because the particular example is not just somebody is disturbing me, but they're disturbing me by talking, either by talking loudly or by talking about nonsense, and that is distracting me. So now we're going to delve into, again, what I keep referring to as this sort of subatomic level as to what's going on with the concept of speech. And then at the end of the letter, we're going to sort of tie it all back together. It's going to cycle back to its origin to explain what we mean when we are talking about a person who's disrupting me, and how it is that I can overcome it. Not just to stick my fingers in my ears and say, la, 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 I'm not listening to you, which is a certain strategy, just to double down on my personal spiritual intensity. Additionally, to now I have a whole other lens through which I can see and comprehend this experience. So again, we're up to Vihine Noida, behold, it is known. It's marked off in your lessons in Tanya as the 27th day of Tishrei for the Chitas. Hopefully everyone can find it. We have those who are aware of Chain. Chain is an acronym for Chachmas Nisteres, the hidden wisdom. And again, as I'm emphasizing, Tanya takes us through the sort of alignment of all of these different perspectives and brings them into a unity. And again, this is not only true here, but this is just another very good example of the whole mission statement of Tanya and Hasidus as a whole. Whereas prior to Hasidus Chabad, all of these different forms of analysis were seen in individual columns. So we had the very literal narrative, the stories in Torah, just understanding exactly, as we refer to it, as the pshat. What is just the basic story? What happened? When you have many stories where it's complicated and there has to be all different speculation. Then we have the remez. What is the life lesson that we can derive from these stories? That we're not just reading stories for knowing the history. We want to understand the message. Then we have the sort of poetry that goes on with these stories, not just how they were in their moment and some life lesson, but the broader sense. Then we have the soy, again, what I'm calling the subterranean, what's going on, like we would say, at a biochemical lesson, like we can all observe when the child's eating too much sugar, that's why they're acting out. Or what's going on because it's hot or it's cold or whatever. Well, there's a spiritual underpinning of the interface between the different stages of awareness of Hashem that we call the worlds, the different spheroids and individually and how they interact with each other. And Hasidus Chabad comes to illustrate that these are not four separate, like I call them, silos. They are all actually one, and they flow together when we are able to dig into the deepest of levels. So here, this is what we're doing now. If we have access, or when we access the chen, the chachma nisteres, the hidden wisdom, not because it's hidden because it's bad, but because you have to dig for it, you have to look for it, then we can pull together what's going on at the sort of sticks and stones may break my bones, I'm not listening to you level, which is a strategy for overcoming the person who's being irritating. And then to understand the deeper level that this is an opportunity that Hashem is giving me to steel myself and strengthen and my intent and my focus on the davening. And now we're going to start talking about, again, what's going on in the deeper spiritual worlds and their interactions with each other. And that's what is being referenced here. Ki dvar Hashem, the word of Hashem, because all speech derives from godly speech, and our first, so to speak, introduction to Hashem in Torah is through speech. God said, let there be light. Not just God made light, and not just there was light. God said it. So speech is our first stage of introduction to Hashem. And that is called B'Shem Shechina. It's called the Shechina. Now, we are familiar with this word Shechina, but now we're going to dig a little deeper into what the term Shechina specifically represents. Now, the root word of the word Shechina is the word for resident. A shoichen is one who resides. A shchuna is a neighborhood. The Mishkan is the place where Hashem resides. So Shechina is the presentation of the, in this case, of Hashem into the physical world. Again, just like speech takes what I'm thinking and feeling and makes it available to others. B'lashon Razal, like it says in the Medrash, the Ema Tata, the quote lower mother, which will explain what this means, Umatra Nisa, and the matron, again, we'll explain all these words. B'lashon HaZohar, Ubefrat Bereish Parshas Ve'era, and specifically in the beginning of Parshas Ve'era, the fee why Sheshoichen U'Maslabish B'Nivroyim, because this level of speech, which we've called the lower level of the mother, which we're going to talk about what that means, and the matron, these feminine words. Shechina is a feminine word. It ends in the letter Hey, which indicates that it's feminine. Shechina is called, is because Sheshoichen U'Maslabish B'Nivroyim. It resides and it invests within creation, L'Achiyosem, to give them life. B'lashon Hamukubalim Nikra B'Shem Malchus. And in Kabbalistic terminology, this is called Malchus. Al Shem, Malchus being the act of the king, the verb, but we don't have a word for this in English. But if governors govern, then kings, melechs, Malchus, it is their action of kinging. It is the character and the implementation of the law. Al Shem, which is named for Dvar Melech Sholtan, the word of the king is the authority. And again, we're going to come back to all of this. Ki Melech maning malchusei b'diburei, for a king conducts his kingdom through his spoken word. V'oi taimim acherim, and other reasons, yedim li'edechein, which are known to those who are familiar with, again, Cain, the chokmas nistaros, what I keep calling the subterranean level. Umadah zois, and know ye this, ki yesh bechinas umadreges malchus d'atzilis ubechinas malchus debria v'chulu. There is a level of malchus in atzilis. I know it's a lot of words. We're going to come back to it, and the malchus in bria. Okay, so let's back up here and let's really get a handle on what we're talking about. In a basic theological issue that Tanya has addressed many times before, how do we, finite, limited, imperfect human beings that we are, have any opportunity to be connected with an infinite Hashem? So again, a million miles is a long walk, but 1 mile, now it's less than a million, two. I mean, in concept, you could get there. But from finite to infinite, there is no way that finite can arrive at infinite. So how is it possible for there to be any kind of relationship between the finite and the infinite? This is the question on the table. And the answer, which we have come across so many times, is contained in the concept of tzimtzum. Remember, tzimtzum is how Hashem restrains the full expression of himself so that we are not overwhelmed by his existence. The mechanism through which Hashem communicates with us is speech. Now, one of the, I don't want to say liberties is the wrong word, but one of the mechanisms or tools or strategies that Tanya leans heavily on, certainly not original with Tanya, but Tanya leans very heavily on, is that we are permitted to use human terminology to describe Hashem. That's allowed. You're allowed to talk about Hashem in human terminology. So when we say Hashem had to, we understand that that's really our understanding of it. It's a little bit of a made-up idea. It's not literally that Hashem, quote, has to do anything, because nothing can compel Hashem to any form of compliance. Yet we say that Hashem had to communicate with us through speech. Why? Because, again, within the parameters of how Hashem created the world, there are 3 forms of how a person identifies and expresses their essential self. One is a concentrated and focused thought. And I assume everybody has had the experience where they have something, but they haven't really fully figured it out until they sit down, even amongst themselves, by themselves, and they just think about it until they gather their thoughts, they clarify their thoughts so that they know themselves what they're feeling. Then there is the spoken word, so that you know what I'm thinking. And then there is action that I can physically express. I draw a picture, whatever it is. Now, the thought level is so intensely personal that there isn't really any way for you to fully understand it. Yes, it's true that I can get a sense of what somebody is thinking by their body language and by their tone and by their facial expression. It's a very distant level of real comprehension. When a person makes something, well, when they go away and that item is there, it's hard for me to know who the person is. Yes, maybe if I'm extraordinarily sensitive, I could look at a piece of fine art and understand that this person made this out of joy, they made it out of hope, they made it out of disappointment, whatever it may be. It would require such a super level of sensitivity, both on the artist and the art appreciator, that it becomes very difficult to really connect with this piece, with the artist through his art. So the Goldilocks middle ground is speech. The speech is directly connected to the speaker, and therefore we can recognize people by their voice patterns. We can recognize them by their inflection. And if a person is truly articulate, they are able to express what they are thinking in a manner that the listener genuinely absorbs these thoughts in a manner that penetrates from the speaker to the listener. And there becomes a real deep connection. So speech is the access point through which the king communicates and bonds with the people. So yes, we have writing, and we have expressive physical art. Speech is the method through which we can most profoundly connect from speaker to listener. Now, this is illustrated in the most stark manner with the idea of the king conducting through decree. the king makes this announcement. Or again, we would use the analogy, how does the Rebbe communicate with through the Farbrengen? I mean, the Farbrengen was still the primary method of communication, where the people came and listened. Today we have video and we can watch it and so on, and it does create a lot of that connection, but there is something that is just not there, that was there, where the Rebbe spoke and you were there and you heard it live and so forth. I mean, lahavdil, this is true even with other great orators. You can listen to great speeches of wise people. There is still something about being present in the moment. Now, this is given all of these sort of feminine metaphors. We talk about it being the ema tata, the mother that expresses, or the matronisa, which is like the mistress or the queen in this context, or malchus, which again is also the consequence of all of the midos invested within this mechanism, this point of connection between speaker and listener, between king and subject. A lesson from these feminine characteristics is that became the access point, that if the king was inaccessible, well, you could go to the queen, and she was more accessible. She was more of the ambassador to the community than the king, because the king was not as accessible. So speech has got this feminine characteristic because it becomes the access point through which the subjects can connect with and can reach and bond with the king. Because again, the king was too inaccessible, and the queen became that access point. Speech is the access point between the deepest levels of the king and the people who are able to hear it. This is the link, and this is that level of connection. Now, Malchus, as we have spoken about many times, remember the layout of the spheres, Malchus is ultimately the decision. And the decision is, again, what the person decides at some point. They got to choose. They have to make a verbal expression of their decision. And that incorporates all of the more personal spheres that can't be expressed. So it's like the decision. So all of my character goes into it, my intellect, my behavioral character, my chachma, my chesed, etc., until I come out with Malchus. Malchus is the sum total of all the parts that start from the top and go through my whole system and are spit out with, here's the suggestion, or here's the answer, or here is the decision. Now, the Tanya continues. I'm sorry, there's one other point here, that there's Malchus, this level, in the Atzilus level. Remember, Atzilus is total awareness of Hashem. The word Atzilus means next to, that I am my own identity, but my identity is subsumed in my relationship with Hashem. And if you recall, the analogy of the pregnant woman and the relationship between the baby and the mother is indisputable, even though the baby has its own identity. That's this level of Atzilus. It's the stage of the highest awareness. And then there's a Malchus level that leads into Bria. Bria is like the newborn. It can be in a different room than its mother, but it's still absolutely linked and dependent to its mother. And then each of the stages of awareness, as they are developed in their distancing from the origin. Uperish Malchus d'Atzilus. What we mean when we say Malchus of Atzilus, who Dvar Hashem, Amachayev, Amahava, and Neshamas Hagadelis. This is again the word of Hashem. And hopefully, I've been able to communicate where we're going with this. We talked about the word and the person who's talking to me while I'm trying to daven, or they're talking in my space while I'm trying to daven. And how is it that the word, what is going on here with the word, the speaking, the talking, which is disruptive talk? So again, as we're doing what I keep referring to as the subatomic analysis of what speech is, it helps us to understand what is going on in the spiritual dynamic with this speaker while I am trying to daven. shehein mebechinas atzilis, that this spoken word that gives these neshamas existence that come from the level of atzilus. And again, you may recall that we talk about that tzaddikim, their neshamas are naturally more sensitive to Hashem. Everybody's got their sensitivities, and the tzaddik's neshama is naturally more sensitive, like atzilus. That is, it's absolutely aware, just like, again, in the analogy, the infant with the fetus within the mother is absolutely aware of the mother. So too, some neshamas are always born with this absolute sensitivity of awareness. Kamei neshamas Adam Arishain, like Adam. Adam knew that God existed. That was absolute. It wasn't something that he believed, that he speculated on, that he was persuaded, that made sense to him, that I agreed with. Adam knew it. Why? It was the breath of life was breathed into his nostrils. So he was constantly aware of his relationship with Hashem. You know, we can easily forget that we are dependent on oxygen, but go underwater and you remember pretty fast. But since we can't get outside of Hashem, it could be harder to remember that we are dependent on Hashem because we have no contrasting circumstance. Well, Adam, in a sense, had that kind of awareness. He was constantly being vivified by the breath of Hashem, as we are, but to him it was a little more obvious. That's called the neshama of Atzilus. And the neshamas of our forefathers and the prophets, they are absolutely aware of this as well, because God is giving them existence. Shahayu mirkavel Hashem mamash. They are an absolute chariot to Hashem. Remember the analogy of the chariot, that they are in absolute subservience to Hashem, like the chariot is to its driver. They are simply an extension of Hashem. Ubetelim mamish b'metzias love, and therefore they are completely surrendered to Him. It's not that I have decided that this is a good place for me to invest my identity. We become absolutely subsumed in this level. Like it says, that God literally speaks through the throat of Moshe. Meaning, in a couple of weeks, we're going to begin the book of Devarim. The book of Devarim begins, these are the words which Moshe spoke. So we go, what do you mean? Hold on. Now Moshe says, well, now let me tell you what I think. Enough of what God thinks. I mean, that would be ridiculous. Do we really think that Moshe is now stepping out of his role and says, well, now that I'm finished with this, now let me tell you what I think? No, that would be foolish. The idea is that Hashem speaks through Moshe. Prior to this level, Hashem talks to this man named Moshe. And Moshe talks to us. Now Hashem speaks directly through Moshe. It's so aligned that Hashem doesn't speak to Moshe and then speak to us. Hashem speaks through Moshe. V'chein kol neviim abali ruach HaKodesh. Ha'kol v'dibra elim eslavish v'koyim v'diburim. Mamash k'mesh kosev ha'arisa. So too, essentially, this is what every prophet is. God is speaking through him. Now, again, in the back of our minds, this guy who's talking while I'm trying to daven, is God speaking through him? Is this Hashem putting it through as an opportunity for me to strengthen my davening, to steel myself? If I could reconfigure that, and to use an analogy, I never was in the army, but they have to do like these exercises where my fellow soldier now has to pretend to be the enemy so that I can get stronger. So now I start to see, I'm not angry at him. I realize he's doing me a great kindness. He's giving me that opportunity. Or, imagine if you went to a gym and you saw someone exercising and there's someone yelling at them to lift these heavy things. What a mean person. Why are you telling me to lift heavy things? Well, if I understand, if I can reconfigure my perspective and see that this person is actually helping me, then even this guy who's talking while I'm trying to daven, even though consciously, if you would ask him, why are you doing that? He says, well, I do whatever I want. And I don't care. And I don't like that he davens and that's what he thinks. But even Haman is a servant of Hashem. Even Bilam is a servant of Hashem. And that's why Bilam tells us about the coming of Mashiach, because Bilam is the most aligned servant of Hashem. He's absolutely in alignment. But if you ask him, he doesn't think so. He thinks he's trying to hurt us. Umalchus the bria hu dvar Hashem amachayim mahaban hashamas hamalachim shoyim habriya shemay lasem kamayis atzilas v'chulu. Umalchus dasi hu dvar Hashem amachayim mahavis odem hazeh b'chlal. You say to offer mamayim asher mitachas la'aretz. So when Hashem is speaking in the Malchus level of Atzilus, he is creating the inhabitants of Atzilus, the Avos, our ancestors, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Moshe. When Hashem is Malchusing in Bria, he's bringing to life the inhabitants of Bria. And when Hashem is Malchusing in Asiya, which is our world, the least naturally, intuitively aware of godliness world, Hashem is bringing into existence all the creations of this world, even that guy who's annoying me right now. Now, again, we're not about exonerating that guy. It's about what is my response to his presence. Well, here the Alter Rebbe adds, but in the lands of those who serve the piles, which is a even more derogatory term for idol worshipers, they just serve things that are piles of junk, because where are all those things that we aspire to wind up in 2 years from now? In the junk bin. So all of this godliness is filtered down through the 70 designated spiritual entities that coordinate the 70 nations. This is a general rule that we have. We talk about the 70 nations, and that each nation has its spiritual authority. And as we're familiar with, on the days of Sukkot, the first day we have 70 sacrifices, and 60, 50, 40, 30, 20, 10, because we are not only thinking about ourselves, we're thinking about the nations as well. Even though Sukkot is how Hashem protected us when we were in the wilderness, we also are considerate of Hashem's interface and relationship with the nations. We can't forget about that. That this spark that comes from the word of Hashem, that is the Malchus of Asiya. Asiya is our world. Umeir al hasorim shalmaila bebechinas makif melmaila, and it radiates on the sorim, these designated, what we're calling officers, in a manner that surrounds this highest level. But it does not become fully invested within them, because this is the sort of pushback that our humanity does. It doesn't want that godliness inside, but God does it anyway. He takes care of us despite the fact that we try to push him out. And from there, it all the way manifests itself to, and again, this is that point that the Alter Rebbe addressed much earlier in the Sefer Shalbeinim, since Hashem is the creator of all matter and the sustainer of all matter, how can anything be in conflict with Hashem? How can anything rebel against Hashem? How can anything go against Hashem? And it goes all the way down even to the animals in this physical world, because everything is sustained continuously by Hashem. Even into the literal soil and the atmosphere of this physical world, because again, Hashem is embedded in all matter, or we might say Hashem is all matter. And that's why we don't say, well, God can't be there. We talked about this yesterday. Why is Bilam the one who foretells Mashiach? Because otherwise, if Mashiach doesn't come to redeem Bilam, then we're putting a limitation on Hashem. We're saying, well, Hashem can't go there. Bilam is out. And this is not we don't have this. Well, we're good, you're bad. We're going to heaven and you're not. Because if anyone is left out, it's putting a limitation on Hashem, as if Hashem cannot reach that person. And again, the difference is that the kosher animals, they're getting their godliness through what we call klipas noiga. Remember, klipa means a shell. You don't see the godliness like a shell. You don't see the walnut inside. But sometimes the shell allows the idea, meaning we use the analogy of an orange. You see the orange peel, you don't see the fruit, but you could imagine that there's something edible in there. And the other times, the klipa is so thick, like a walnut, that you can't even imagine that there's something edible in there unless you crush it. And if you crush the shell, you can imagine it. So the kosher animals are kosher because their godliness, like the orange, is accessible or is imaginable. And the non-kosher animal, its godliness is not imaginable. It's not accessible. So here the Alter Rebbe has introduced 3 levels, so to speak, or a 4th level, really, well, which we'll get to, of the stages of klipa. You have a godliness which sustains the creations outside of the holy. So the physical objects that are sustained by godliness, which, again, our imagination doesn't take too much work to get to. You could imagine that there's got to be godliness in that pencil, otherwise the pencil couldn't exist. Even though the pencil doesn't look godly, it feels godly. 2, that Gullus begins with the introduction of violation, which we'll get to, which is the sin of course, the eating of the tree of knowledge. That is, we bring in this awareness of death into the world. And then we have the most profound manifestation, which is our job, which is to be a light unto the nations, not just other people, but to bring the godliness out within the physical world. Now, was going to be later on, there's going to be a 4th level that's so harsh, that is when this guy is talking while I'm trying to daven. Meaning not only is the world not innately receptive and announcing of godliness, not announcing or receptive, it's actively working against it because I'm trying to daven and this guy is talking. So you have such a deep gullus that not only is the world not interested, sometimes we make them say, people will respect you. No, they don't. They think it's silly. What are you doing that for? Why are you depriving yourself of McDonald's? So that's one level. Then there's a worse level. They say you should not be doing that. Do not be doing mitzvahs. They're actively campaigning against it. That's a deeper gullus. And that's what we're going to be talking about. Now, we talked about how Hashem has to be in the nations. We don't say, well, who cares about them? We've told this story many times before, but it's a longer story where the Rebbe called for a campaign about something that was going on in the New York City public schools. And people were asked, like, what do you care? Your Hasidim don't go to the New York City public schools, don't when you... And the Rebbe was like, well, what's the difference? I can't say, well, Hashem isn't in the New York City public schools. I can't say that Atzilus and Asiya can be separated. I don't say, well, what do I care? It's none of my business. None of my business. My Hasidim don't go. They're fooey on them, even though it might be tempting to say fooey on them. They seem to be saying fooey on themselves, but we're not giving up on them just because they're in the New York City public schools. So this link now. So our concern is with the nations. Now, remember when Yaakov Avinu came down to Egypt, he brought 70 souls, and a distorted form of this is to take 7 spheros with the 10 interfaces between them, like we talk about during the counting of the Omer, how the spheros interplay with each other. And in the godly sense, we bring it out into the world. We take the 70 into Egypt and we elevate it. But if it's distorted, because once it's put out in this world, it gets distorted, the world takes it and they create 70 independent nations, many of whom are committed to the annihilation of holiness. Why do they hate the Jews? Because the Jews represent godliness. They don't hate the Jews. Why do they care? Because they hate the idea of holiness. That's what they hate. They try to eliminate this idea of holiness. So why does Hashem sort of run this risk? Because if we can evoke that level of godliness from within the world, then we are able to fill the world with the knowledge of Hashem. So why put godliness into Egypt? Why put godliness into Bilam? Why put godliness into the guy who's talking? Because we can discover that guy, discover the godliness within that guy, within that circumstance. And again, that illustrates the true infinity of Hashem. So here we go. V'hine, Shemayim v'aretz v'chol asher behem b'artzos ovdei gululim, kulam kolei mamash chashiv l'gabi asarim shem chayusam v'kayum. The heavens and earth, meaning even the most glamorous of the physical creations. When we say heavens here, we mean the sky. We don't mean the spiritual sense. They too are completely subjugated to the spiritual guide. And that is something that we observe. I mean, this is why all fascists hate God. They hate the concept that there's a power beyond themselves. I'm the ultimate power. I have the biggest army. I'm in charge. I have to be in charge, and therefore God threatens the dictator, because God means that there's infinity. So all of the, even the loftiest, the mountains and so on, are all completely surrendered to the designated spiritual entities. I mean, we might even make this argument that this is the cultural concept. You know, we in America, we do this. We think that everybody wants what we want. They want drive-through pizza and democracy. And we forget that other cultures have a deep-rooted history, and they don't want to just be uprooted and transformed into American politically, culturally, socially, etc., because they are subjected to their innate identity. Okay. Vasarim, and even that, which we might, again, borrow and say, like the cultural identity, is also subjected to the word of Hashem. Remember that concept of the word, the spoken word, the expression that creates it. So whereas a culture, let's say the French, think that they are embedded in their identity as French because of their topography, because of their shared history, because of their language, because of their cultural achievements, because of their arts and so forth. What, again, I'm borrowing as an analogy of the spiritual idea of their spiritual identity, their sarim, these officers, these spiritual entities. But even that is subjected ultimately to the infinity of Hashem. And again, we know this because biologically, the deeper we go, the Frenchman's heart and blood is the same as the Englishman's heart and blood, even if they are conceptual enemies of each other, even if their behaviors are completely diverse, even oppositional, their biology is the same. Well, this is the same idea in the spiritual. You know, we're starting here, remember the stencil analogy, and as we go up in the deeper origins of it, we find links between, well, let's even, again, I'm harping a little too much on this analogy, but think about this country. So people who come from the South may consider themselves completely different than people who come from the Northeast. And people who come from big cities may say, we have nothing in common with people who come from small towns. But then, especially the time when you had a draft, everybody comes into the army. And suddenly they start to find themselves surrendered to the broader notion of the country than their regional individual identity. And then even to something greater of their commitment when they ally with the allies in unified service. So they thought that they were from this town, then they see that they're American, then they see they're of the allies. And as we get into the deeper, more meaningful aspect of their purpose, their individuality becomes that much more surrendered to something greater. So that's an analogy in the social sense. Well, here in the spiritual sense, we're saying each nation has its spiritual culture. I mean, to borrow an idolatrous term, like we call it that's my spirit animal. You know, people use that term sort of colloquially. You know, that's where they model themselves after that. And we use it as a half a joke. But then as they become more deeply aware of their origin, and this is why You don't have to be Jewish to be connected with Hashem. You don't even have to drop necessarily your cultural character. You can access it through that format, or lahavdil, not that this is the same thing, but again, just to illustrate this point, you have Sfard and Ashkenaz and so on. They don't have to abandon their minhagim in order to be in alignment with the infinity of Hashem. We don't say which one is right. Is it supposed to be Ashkenaz or Sfard? Which one is right? It's not about a right or wrong. Okay. So again, where we're ultimately headed is speech all the way down to that guy who's talking while I'm trying to daven. And that's the key point that we're headed to. But we're going incrementally, especially since I keep going down these distracted points. Okay. What happens? That this divine spark that is the origin, and this is the question, how is it possible for anything to rebel against Hashem when it is continuously dependent on Hashem? But what happens is it becomes so minimized that we forget about it. And it happens to the Jewish people too. The analogy of the kid who's riding on his father's shoulders and he forgot. He says, "Where's my father?" And then the father gives him a little shuckle, and all of a sudden he remembers. Meaning we forget what we're dependent on. I don't need nothing from nobody. We forget that there is this continuous source like oxygen. Then you go underwater and you remember it. Well, we can't get outside of Hashem, so it becomes, in that sense, harder to remember. That's why we call it other gods, or the God of gods. Because they are a form of godliness. Now, this is really odd. Commonly, the word other gods is used as a disparaging term for those who worship idols. They don't worship God, they worship other gods. Or they make the mistake of saying, well, of course, God is the ultimate authority, but there are other authorities too. There are other gods, and God is the God of gods, like the King of Kings. He's the God of gods. But here the Alter Rebbe says a whole nother understanding of this phrase. The Tanya gives a whole new insight. They're called other gods because they consider themselves authoritative, and they only refer to Hashem as the main God. But they lost the sense of their connection. Now, this was a very difficult circumstance where people felt that God was so inaccessible, as we've talked about before. We've made God so great, we made him irrelevant. God is infinite, infinite, infinite. Well, I just want to make sure my crops grow and I can pay my rent this week. So infinite, infinite, infinite doesn't seem like it's going to be too concerned with me. And if somebody comes along and says, well, I'll help you pay the rent. Okay, sure, sign me up. Because that's what I need. I need to pay the rent. And infinite, infinite, infinite is so outside of me. So they didn't deny God, but they attributed independent capacity to these other forces, whatever those forces were, the market, the academy, et cetera, et cetera. So what happens? They took the godliness that is invested in all of these entities and they made it its own God. An example, in the 19 teens and 20s, so during the whole communist revolution and so forth, as we know, Jews were very much behind it. Now, again, it's easy to disparage them now, but at the time, the alternative is the czar, and anything looks better. Communism sounds like a great idea. Everyone's going to share. What could be bad? So people were debating, if you can imagine, and they talk politics, and everybody's a chacham, and they think they know better. So they approached the Frierdiker Rebbe, and they asked, just settle this argument for us once and for all. Which of the systems is Torah? Is Torah a monarchy? Is Torah a democracy? Is Torah a republic? Is it socialist? Which one is it? Which one is it? So the Frierdiker Rebbe said, Torah is its own independent system. The good things which you will find in any other system derive from Torah, but Torah is none of those. And this comes up from time to time. Oh, Torah says you have to vote for this guy or that guy. Torah is its own system. So the same thing here. What happens? We find something virtuous in the world. We start to make it God. We start to put our absolute trust in it. because what we have sensed, what we're smelling there, is the godliness that is contained within it. So this is how the Alter Rebbe is now reading this idea that they refer to God as the God of gods. Not that they're denying God, not that they're serving something other than Hashem. They're serving, though, this very limited aspect of Hashem. They find this one point, and they make that into its own identity, as if it is independent of Hashem. So it's the godliness that's attractive there that allures the people to be aligned with it. And that is what ultimately leads to the service of something other than Hashem. We know that word avodah zarah, and we call it idolatry and so on. But again, the idol worshippers were not stupid. They didn't literally think that this rock created the world or ran the world. They associated some divine power to it. And what they were worshiping, again, you're always going to have fools, but what they were worshiping was the divine that was within it, instead of recognizing that that kernel of holiness is the expression of the essential infinite of God. But again, infinite was so overwhelming that it held no appeal to them. What am I supposed to do with infinite? But this level of godliness is going to get me my rent paid. I'm all about it. And we hear this from time to time, again, very loose analogy. When we like those things of Judaism, we like education and we like honoring parents and family and all these different things that at least the myth is particularly associated with the Jewish people. And we want to cherry pick that because I like that because that gets me what I want. And I think that I can somehow pluck that out from the infinity of Hashem because the infinity doesn't appeal to me. Infinity is like studying the astronomy. It's interesting, but I just want to know how to get the car started in the morning. That's it. I don't have this curiosity about something or this attraction to something outside of myself. So when I become pragmatically oriented, in other words, what is God going to do for me? So then I pluck out the things that work for me. This makes me happy. This gives me joy. This gives me whatever I want. I pluck those things out. Until what will happen? All of that will melt away. The setting that crusts around this godliness will ultimately dissipate, and what will be left will be the raw essential godliness. And this is what will happen with the concept of Mashiach. He will expose that what we were after is the kernel of godliness that's contained in this whole setting. And then when the setting falls away, that godliness that was so meaningful to us in the moment becomes evident as being part of the greatest godliness, the infinity of godliness, and I become aligned with that. But we get caught up along the way in all kinds of, as we call it, mishigas. L'kroya kulam b'shem Hashem, and that's why everyone will call out on the name of Hashem. Even that guy who's talking, who again thinks he's found some connection with some level of godliness. This is what we mean when we talk about the Shekhinah is in exile. Remember this rule of thumb. We say in all of our suffering, God suffers. That when we were sent into exile, God came into exile with us, which is on the one hand very reassuring, but it's also a little embarrassing. Look where we've dragged God. If my father comes to bail me out of prison, I feel very loved, but I'm also humiliated. Look what I've done. I brought God down into the prison. So what's happened? We have harped on some godly aspect, like in the analogy of the different political systems, and we try to create an entire identity and relationship with Hashem out of that kernel, not realizing that that is linked to something far greater. And this attempt to sort of cherry pick it is ultimately, fortunately, going to melt away, and we'll see that it's in the absolute oneness and alignment with Hashem. And that's what it means, the Galus Hashchina. When the Jewish people take the essence of Hashem that's invested within them and they bring it into Galus, and again, culturally, we say things like, Jews are academic and Jews become professionals. and we Jews, whatever it is, the social cultural characteristics that we associate, again, we're seeing it a little bit now, that becomes exposed. We thought this was our thing. We thought the Ivy League was our thing. We thought, we're the oppressed. We thought we're aligned with every other oppressed community. We're marching in Selma, and then all of a sudden they all turn their back on it. What happened? Because we were harping on that one little kernel, the Jewish value, and we lost the sense that it is aligned with the infinity of Hashem. And once we separate it out, well, eventually the klipa dies off. That's the good news. And what's left is we realize that it's essentially aligned with the infinity of Hashem. We can't have a Jewish value outside of a godly value, although we kind of thought we could. That we could describe, like I'm calling it again, these social, political, cultural characteristics that we thought were, quote, Jewish, because we thought we could separate them out. But eventually that will, again, dissipate and clear away. So what's happened? The Shechina, which again is the spoken word of Hashem, the expression of Hashem, that's invested and entrusted to us, like our children are invested and entrusted to us, but they don't belong to us, winds up in Gullus because we become consumed or fixated on the kernel of godliness that we see within Gullus, the political systems and so on. And now we've dragged it into this Gullus. And now it will be, released, redeemed, because when the klipa falls away, when we realize that, again, the Ivy League, whatever it is not our identity. That's not really who we are, although we thought it was. So now we become liberated to have just a straight up Kedusha. Where did this gullus come from? How did this godliness get so buried that we think that it's the Jewish thing to support all kinds of non-Torah things? From the tree of knowledge. What was the sin of the tree of knowledge? Amongst many, it was that it made us aware of things that we shouldn't have been aware of. It's like a child. Every parent has this very delicate balancing act. How much do you want to introduce them to the real world? And how much do you want to protect them? Why do they need to know this? Why do they need to know? Why do they need to know that there are people who are Torah observant who look out the window during davening? Why do they need to know that their parents sometimes color out of the lines? Why do they need to know? Let them think that the world is a beautiful, healthy place. Now, unfortunately, we have to. Don't take rides with strangers. Why? Because 0.001% of people are sickos. Why do they need to know this? What is the true form of disruption of a child? You make them aware of something that is about themselves that they shouldn't be aware of. We shouldn't be made aware of death. We shouldn't be made aware of our character, of these aspects of ourselves. Why not? What's so bad? You'll find, because it's not the right time. So what happened? We became aware of this ungodliness before it was time for us to be aware of it. And therefore, it got abused. It got hijacked. So we wind up, again, being attracted to what the Alter Rebbe describes as the hind part of Kedusha. And again, this is manifest in that socio-political sense of, well, that's a very Jewish value. What makes it a Jewish value? Well, a lot of Jewish people do it. And yes, you can find, if you squint hard enough, you can in fact find some suggestion within a Torah source, and then we hang on to that. But then when the Jewish people get driven out, and the Jewish people are leading it, and again, sadly, just to look back, and you see Jewish kids at these encampments thinking that they are proclaiming a Jewish value. And they're saying, but what about the Jewish value of cherishing life? And what about the Jewish value? And so on. And they'll espouse to you all the Jewish value, but they are, again, distorting it. They have brought the Shechina into Gullus, thinking that it's Kedusha. And this is what it means when we were sent out into Edom, which is Rome, into hedonism. We bring the Shekhinah with us. And we think that this is the holy thing to do. We think this is the Jewish thing to do. This is what we should be doing. This is the mistake that we make. We take the godliness into that level. That's why it's true. Hashem is everywhere. That the Zohar refers to God's speech as his name. The name I use like a telephone number. It's a mechanism of contacting, right? Why do I need a name? So someone else can get my attention. It's absolutely one with Hashem. Nevertheless, ha'arav amshachas achayis anamshachas miruach piv yisparech mischalekes ledalid madrega shenis shein dalid oilimus atzilis bria yitzira asiya vashini umachmas simsui umasechem rabim letzamtzei ma'or v'achayis lestiroi shlayir meir kol kach b'elim abriya k'mei b'elim atzilis. This form of Hashem expressing himself is manifest in 4 levels. That is 4 degrees of awareness. Like we know, a person can say something very profound, but if the recipient is not that sensitive, they only hear a very shallow aspect of what's being said. An example is like poetry. I mean, I don't know anything about poetry, but if a person is very sensitive, they hear a deep meaning and beauty, and the other person only hears the description of the color of certain flowers. Roses are red, violets are blue. Okay, I know that. Why? Because the recipient is not sensitized to the deeper meaning that is being communicated through the poetry. So Hashem expresses himself in these 4 stages. Remember, Atzilus, total awareness of Hashem. I only exist because of Hashem. Bria, I exist. What am I? I don't know, but Hashem created me. Yitzira, I can tell you a little bit more about myself because this is what Hashem made about me. And Asiya, which is the spiritual side of our world, which is, I'm busy doing what I do. Oh, yeah, God. So again, it's the same spoken word or any intellectual lecture. The recipient's capacity to understand it is how they experience it. It doesn't change the expressive sense of itself. Just because I don't understand poetry doesn't make poetry less beautiful. Just because I don't understand astrophysics or trigonometry or history doesn't make it any less profound. But my experience degrades it. You know, that's why the Mona Lisa is hung in a museum. Why don't you just hang on the street? Everyone can see it. Because if I can't be bothered to go, then I don't have any appreciation of it. It's not, there's no change in Hashem. Again, the person teaching the poetry to an advanced group of poets is no different than the poetry taught to a bunch of ludnuts. Shidvar Hashem v'ruach piv. It all comes from Hashem. It's expression of Him. Begam bechinas ha'arav amshachas achayis in ha'arav shebatzilis b'kas ha'mesach mislabeshes b'bria. So from Atzilus, it passes through the mask. That's one of those words. It's the same in Hebrew. It pierces through it, and it reaches that level of Bria. It comes all the way down here, meaning where is God? Wherever you look for Him. The burning bush only became the source of Hashem communicating to Moshe when Moshe said, oh, look, a bush that is burning and not being consumed. Let me go and investigate. In other words, we walk past burning bushes all the time, but we're not sensitized to it. Why didn't I see that? We see this like in business. Why didn't I think to invest in that business? Because I don't have the sensitivity to it. Either because I'm too consumed with myself or because I'm just not that sensitive a soul, whatever it is. It's not Hashem that's not evident. It's my inability to see it. And that's this idea. It's the same Hashem in Atzilus as it is in Asiya. Hashem is no different in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur than he is in the bank on an ordinary weekday. It's just my sensitivity to it, my receptivity. So I'm keep on complaining. Why doesn't God reveal himself? I'm talking, you're not listening. In this physical world, through the Malchus level, which is the link from point to point to point, from world to world to world. And again, you can see where this is heading. That guy who's doing this is the same talk that as Hashem creating the whole world. But this is annoying, and that's beautiful. Why? Well, maybe, again, I can't stop him, but I can change my perspective. And if I change my sensitivity and my awareness, I see godliness in this, like I see the godliness in the true and the infinite. All right, stop here.